Hello. I think I have to begin by stating that this began with a mistake, a technical mistake. I suppose I should have brought the PowerPoint. The part of the quality of the images has to do with when they date from. The other part of its quality has to do with a faulty PowerPoint to PDF export. So I'm sorry about that, but I have the other one, the original, with me. Okay. So in 1984, works begin in Bucharest at what was called the Victory of Socialism Boulevard and the adjoining new civic center, crowned by what was later dubbed the House of the People, that you see here in an image of the early 90s. The building of the entire ensemble covers around 485 hectares of the previously existing built fabric and raises it. This meant that thousands, countless actually, nobody actually counted them, of buildings were demolished, such as you see there, mainly stemming from the late 19th century and early 20th. Churches and other, well, actually, not churches and, with a few exceptions, other structures such as the belfry of the Mihai Vod monastery that you see here were displaced in order to save them from demolitions. That's belfry and church on rails that you see in the pictures. And obviously, this involved the eviction of tens of thousands of people. That was done almost overnight. On top of this, an entire hill of the previously existing city was leveled, and obviously this was done to achieve the building that I'm afraid you've already familiar with. Now, this presentation will focus on mainly two aspects. First, I will try to speak a little bit about the architectural language of the main buildings and the urban layout of the ensemble. That at first glance suggests a false affinity with the affinity of ideas with the Western contemporary theories and practices. There was an entry on Bofill at the beginning of the day. Apparently, Romanian architects did work with Bofill books on their tables. Secondly. I shall be pointing to a strange conflictual urban condition that this operation has generated when regarded from the outside. An outside that is construed both in a physical and literal sense from the point of view of its design principles as well. Now, as already stated, the ensemble is comprised of a monumental building and a boulevard leading to it. It's not important what their original ascribed names were, Boulevard of the Union, of National Union, and House of the Republic, kind of a Palace de Republic, if you will. They were already at the time in the 80s embedded into everyone's consciousness as House of the People and Victory of Socialism Boulevard. Now, the grouping of the two is somewhat covered in mysteries, as are a lot of things about this period. There is apparently no written document that testifies to anything related to this operation. I'll actually get back to this. But there are three hypotheses linked to concurring hypotheses linked to the origins of such an idea. One, The first one is linked to Ceausescu's decision to concentrate all power and strategical institution into a newly erected ensemble after the 1977 devastating earthquake that you see in the image. This was supposed to cover all key institutions and basically every building where he would step foot in. This is rumored to be linked to his personal experience during the quake, and a certain type of a way of assuring that something like this would at least never happen to him again. The second hypothesis is linked to the pre-existing existence of an interwar project from the 1930s that would develop a part of the city a small part of the city that was covered, so to speak, by the House of the People. The part of the city that was formerly the city's arsenal. The 1930s project developed this into suggested this development into a new type of modern city center. There are no drawn or accounts of this project, and I'll get back to this as well. There's a third hypothesis, actually recently submitted by in a French doctoral thesis, actually a doctoral thesis written in France, that links it to international models either from the Soviet Union or directly to Speer's north-south axis from 1939, leading to the Great Hall, incredibly near to where we're standing, actually. Now, one has to pause for a moment and consider that if the first motivation, the first hypothesis is psychological and mainly linked to the personal fears of Ceausescu, the other two hypotheses involve the mediating actions of a specialist, be him an urban planner or an architect, and that they are rooted in a professional culture and in architectural historical precedents that he was certainly not aware of, Ceausescu, the ruler. So they had been, and there are a lot of assumptions here, they had been suggested to him by some urban or architectural professional. Now, whatever the actual inspiration was, the project of the building and the boulevard underwent a very warped route before actually being settled. These tribulations involve an invited competition in several stages, a competition that was there was a very respected figure among architectural professionals and a member of one of the design teams that participated to this competition, Ștefan Lungu, who warned everyone reading his this history in the late 90s or afterward, that when one hears or encounters the word competition, one should be very careful regarding what one considers an actual competition now as opposed to what was going on at the time. There was no design brief, no jury, no rules. So it was a competition in the sense that 30 professionals were invited to submit projects. In her book called Architecture in the Communist Project, Ana Maria Zahariade collects and organizes this scattered information and testimonies that attest to the way in which the final project was decided upon, trying to shed light on a process that is somewhat hidden. She retraces these steps from the very first stage, where 30 teams competed with different projects through the ruler's so from these early stages, through the ruler's opaque decision process, through maneuvering going on in the backstage, and ending until the final and surprising decision to build what was eventually actually built was taken. Now, regarding the opaque selection process, reportedly, Ceausescu was confused when he looked at 30 projects. They were projects that were extremely nuanced and varied, not necessarily extremely nuanced, but they were not working in a similar direction. They were the brief said, "Tell us how the new civic center is to look like." So imagination was everything, and he didn't actually look at everything. He expressly stated that the options should be more limited until the next time that they are presented to him, because they're too confusing. Regarding the backstage maneuvering, there are also accounts of people that have witnessed intimidation or coercion from what was at the time regarded the court architect of Ceausescu, that he used to eliminate other teams from the competition. If the initial projects were, as I said, free exercises on a suggested theme, what the new civic center of the city may be, and they were, in a certain sense, autonomous, complete compositions. They were large, but not as large, not enormous. They were authoritarian, yet suggesting a more nuanced architectural approach, able to operate with scale, topography, and also the extant city parts in a more complex way. To attest this, for example, you may consider the placing of a very important monastery on a hill nearby the river. This is actually the monastery that you have previously seen on wheels, the belfry and the church on wheels, and the place was cleared in order to make room for the even larger project. Also, a lot of other details of these projects speak to their comparative quality. Each time, and this is also a lot of these informations stem from personal discussions with the architects who were working on at the time, and this is actually the only method. Sorry. The only method possible to use in the absence of any written documentation. So each time Ceausescu demanded for an increase in scale and a simplification of the urban layout, and in the end reduced everything to the most blatant axial composition, and also chose the most inexperienced team to carry out the project. The following slides are going to be competing projects for a phase of the competition going on in 81, 82, and actually also in 79. So starting from 79, all testifying to monumental intentions and architectural expressions that stem from a postmodern reappreciation of classical vocabulary and composition, often cross-fertilized by overstating national or regional elements. In her article called The Infamous Anca Petrescu, Authorship and Authority in Romanian Communist Architecture, Dana Weiss argues that the authorship of the final project erected, although legally established, is in fact questionable. But if from a formal point of view, the House of the People has always had an author in the person of the then young hope out-of-school architect Anca Petrescu, Nicolae Ceaușescu seems to this day to be the only acknowledged author of the building's urban layout, if for no other reason than only because no designer or planner has ever claimed it. Even after the main layout of the building was decided upon, alternatives to improve about Ceaușescu's authorship and way of working. This is a picture showing one-on-one mock-up models that he approved in order to allow for the building to carry on further. There were alternatives to improve this urban layout that were hoped and worked on, such as the attempt that you see here on behalf of a team of architects to bend the axis of the boulevard and to introduce a small variation in the width of the boulevard that allows for these buildings that you see here in green to be saved. The buildings were the central market hall that you see here in the image and the Brâncovenesc Hospital, where I was actually born. And the operative word is "were" because, as you imagine, the suggestion, the proposition was not carried further. Now, alongside some of the initial proposals, this project, as well as the topics of the articles in the main architectural magazines of the time, topics that dealt with Rossi or Gregotti, Krier, Sterling, and so on, testified to some sort of attunement of a certain architectural circles to Western architectural debate, and also to their capacity, even if limited, to somehow contextualize postmodern ideas into a very different political and professional milieu. Indeed, Augustin Ioan, another contemporary scholar, describes the fertile artistic tensions existing in the School of Architecture, where the younger generation, fascinated with the latest European fashion, challenged the established modernist authority of the older one. But in his questioning of postmodernism in Romania, what Augustin Ioan expressly emphasizes is the total lack of any critical discourse and the impossibility for any such criticism to exist. In the absence of such criticism, the examples that you have seen range from the guilty illusion that one may practice architecture in sync with the West, to subversive tactics hoping to hide one's architectural expertise behind what may be considered professional submission to a political authority. In contrast, what was actually built testifies to the threefold conditions that Ana Maria Zahariade sets at the basis of what she calls occult architecture. And I quote from her article: "The absence of a written architectural brief or any precise written data concerning either functional, economical, aesthetic program, whatever, nothing exists. A total financial nonchalance regarding what the project or the different initiative entails, and the absence of this architecture from any professional publication, its protection from any public exposure." End of quote. As such, the house and the boulevard were and still remain a puzzle in the architectural history of the country, a puzzle that is made out of several pieces: the architectural brief, the criteria for selecting a specific design, the professional participation to the project, and the details of the subsequent erection of the building, but mostly the sense of the entire endeavor. Where was this boulevard supposed to lead, or what would have been the end stage of the development? I have actually hoped to grow a little bit closer to a possible answer to these questions, but each time everybody assumes there isn't or there was no purpose. That it was simply pointless. Now, no one knows. Rumor has it that at a certain moment overnight, the decision to double the length of the axis was taken. Such arbitrary decisions cannot be linked to any project on or for the city. Instead, instead of reconsidering the historical strata of the city, especially after the damages already provoked by the earthquake, and using the remaining fragments to mold a new vision for the city's future, the project entailed demolitions that equaled a total annihilation of the city's history and its founding anew with no apparent integral vision. This was only possible through a flagrant disregard of land patterns and uses, at a time when property rights related to land ownership were non-existing, as almost all land belonged to the state. The few remaining private properties, the ones that miraculously survived the successive nationalization campaigns of the 1950s, did not constitute a problem. Regardless of whether owners or renters, the inhabitants in the areas set for clearance were given 24 to 48 hours to evict. Documents that attested to the extent of the demolitions did exist. On the one hand, such plans were generated by the planning of the monumental ensemble, but on the other hand, as testified by witnesses, they were also the work of professionals interpreting the daily whims and grand gestures of the dictator and his wife. These plans had mainly a technical character. Someone needed to tell the bulldozers where to stop. This is wrong. Someone also needed to inform inhabitants of their respective eviction. However, these documents were in no direct way linked with the ongoing project for the built ensemble. Moreover, research suggests a second subsequent demolition stage that was either later abandoned or didn't come around until the political changes of 1989. In white, this stems from that recent PhD thesis that I mentioned. In white is are the actual demolitions. What the buildings colored in brown are phase 2 of the demolitions that nobody knew where it would lead. After the trauma of the demolition of one-fifth of its historical fabric, and after the 1989 revolution, Bucharest was left with more pressing questions to be answered than issues of style or urban composition and authorship. With the relative haste of the evictions and the total disregard of property rights that characterized the works on the entire civic center, once the political tidings had changed, claims for reinstating the former landowners or their heirs, presumed invented or actual, also arose. These demands could not be met by simply reinstating previous owners through the redrawing of property limits, no matter what their position in the new urban layout was. The neat, simple, yet disruptive logic of the new boulevard was favored to the older one of the historical city. Accordingly, the authoritarian stage design of the former dictator is slowly appropriated by the contemporary city, at first with reluctance, only to be eventually fully embraced on commercial grounds. The boulevard was supposed to have housed the nomenclatura of the 80s, and as such, apartments are bigger and reputedly better executed and designed. So almost 30 years after the advent of democracy, the question regarding land ownership in the area of the entire urban ensemble is not yet resolved, and actually nowhere near to be so. All the more so, since the disruptions that the works on the House of the People have represented for the city are slowly slipping into oblivion, with the help of both a generalized societal amnesia and the building's endorsement by the current political and religious powers that have chosen to inhabit it, thereby also placing themselves in a position of symbolic continuity with the previous political regime. But if the urban ensemble of the former civic center is now embraced for both its commercial and symbolic value as is, its backstage remains the unseen face of the contemporary city in exactly the same way that it escaped the view of the previous political authority. As such, the rear facades of the Victory of Socialism Boulevard and the spaces behind the curtains of buildings are and remain the more interesting architectural and urban outcomes of the 1980s operation. Just as they were hidden away from the eye of the regime that unintentionally generated them, they evaded the public eye in the years that followed. These areas are places where land ownership patterns have disintegrated due to the abolition of streets and the construction of the newly implied technical infrastructure. They stand in the shadow of the unadorned rear facade of the buildings, whose other face was meant to be seen. They are the original product of the 1980s urban and architectural design of Bucharest, not the overly decorated facade design and urban layout, but its hidden consequence, devoid of any urban and design intent, and ever since abandoned to the city's actual use patterns and to those of the local residents. Recently, these areas have come to the attention of professionals, marking a significant turn that testifies to both a change of focus and a change of scale in the focus. Alternative research and student projects have all concentrated on these areas. All of a sudden, they seem to be valued in themselves, as either as complex urban situations that call for acupuncture rather than grand gestures, or as conflictual conditions that may be dealt with, without taking ideological sides, without any excited retaliation, but with close attention lent to a very tortuous past. This is a diploma project from the ETH Zurich in 2003. This is an intensive international program from 2006. Well, this is an urban intervention from the 2010, and again, school projects going on in the last several years. As such, 30 years after the original erection of the ensemble, these projects mark a desirable yet timid synchronization of the professional culture with the values of contemporary European city. Should the political and administrative authorities not hinder this process, but instead inspire and promote it, over time, the Victory of Socialism may indeed prove to be a fertile laboratory of postmodern architectural approaches, through the encouragement of context-driven designs built upon the thoughtful consideration of urban history. Thank you. I've placed here only the references to which I directly alluded in the presentation.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Was I too long?
No, not that long. It was good. I was not. So I have one question. You presented an ensemble, what probably most of us know from somehow.
You said you're a big fan of Bucharest.
Yes, I am, and yes, because it's completely different what actually Aldo Rossi told about the urban monument, when it's not an urban monument in the city, but as the city become an urban monument or become a larger scale. But is there any smaller scale postmodernism as a counterpart of this kind of classicist powerish architecture?
Whatever there is. The answer is actually not simple. The scholar I cited, Augustini one, actually writes on this question. Was there postmodernism in Romania? That's the research question, if you will. And I actually have to say I agree with him that if you just look at the facades or the images of the buildings, you can't actually decide that is enough for postmodernism to exist. It's a very superficial understanding of what postmodernism would be. In this sense, there are what we would probably all call late modern examples that may be smaller or not so small. There's a string of projects developed actually by the School of Architecture. There's a story to that for culture houses in secondary cities, so not in the capital cities. There are a lot of projects in these other cities that had no similar political importance, or if they had a political importance on a local and regional scale, where postmodern attempts that are linked to, for example, the way in which the building or the ensemble works together with the surrounding urban area may be seen. So yes, there are a lot of undocumented and untapped territories throughout the country. Yeah.
Yeah, because if we think about, I don't know, Ricardo Bofil's housing estates with this same monumentality, with the same scale, larger. It has some kind of connection to this, obviously with a completely different drive.
The architects that I've spoken with testify to the fact that they were working on with postmodern models, but on the other hand, in my view, for example, they misinterpreted them in several senses. I spoke with an architect that designed several of the buildings, of this access, to the other side, and I asked him whether there was not a brief, but some kind of indication regarding how the facade should look like, and most particularly, because it interested me, if there was any type of indication that said that the back facade, which is actually not a back facade, should have no decoration whatsoever. And he said no, that was their decision. Their decision.
Professional decision.
Yeah. Obviously, we're playing as if they had decided the facade, if they had designed the facade full of exuberant decoration to the rear, it's not. There is no guarantee that it would have been built as such. But this is what he said. We didn't think about the back of the building. We thought only about a type of artistic freedom that was not necessarily easy to come by at the time, depending on where one worked. In most places it wasn't.
Okay. More questions? Just one.
May I ask what's the opinion of the public, or it's
I think I'm a little bit deaf. I'm sorry.
Okay. What's the opinion of the public? Does they think that it's a political monument? It's connected with a political regime, or how the society thinking about this assemblies?
This is actually linked to the very first presentation of the day as well, and to the second also. People love it.
Really?
Everybody loves it, and this I took a moment to see if I should introduce any type of nuance in this statement, and I don't think I need to. In the original 1990s, everybody, where I come from, this is almost public knowledge. In the early 1990s, there was a lot of anger towards the house, the demolitions, because people still, a lot more people were alive that lived through the demolitions and that were affected directly. As almost 30 years have passed, I think I can say that people love this now. All of it. In the early 1990s, you would see on the most the postcard representing Bucharest would be a concert hall erected by a French architect, invited architect at the end of the 19th century. Nowadays, the House of the People is the postcard. Yeah, actually,
Thanks.
Actually, with David and Szabolcs, we spent 3 nights in one of these buildings a few years ago, so we have personal experience. But my question is about not about the buildings. So if you forget about these buildings and the appearance, was there any other option for this part of the city for growing, for changing, for developing?
Before Ceausescu, you mean?
Before or instead of?
I think that we have to, all of us firmly believe that there would have been, if not, I'm not exactly sure what we're doing here. But this also goes for what I do think that a different option, instead of a full embrace of the ensemble such as it is, would have been preferable after the changes of 1989. There was a very large international competition that was organized, I think you know about it, won by von Gerkan Margun partner, that covered exactly the areas demolished, but also with the express brief to design or to devise a way to patch the rupture between the previous city and the city of 1980s. And this was a project that was totally forgotten. It was a project that was meant to be somehow integrated into the plans of the development of the city. Instead, what is now going on in Bucharest, and I didn't want to show you anything about this, here, on a scale comparable to the House of the People and larger than it, taller at least than it, the Romanian patriarchy is building sorry, excuse my words. The people, not the people. Yeah, the people's cathedral. It's not a people. It's the nation's cathedral, or something like that. This is why I actually said in the presentation that the ensemble, such as it is embraced by both political and religious authorities of the state nowadays, because they actually are building the cathedral on top of this, whatever it was there. If you look at and this is why the question regarding land ownership rights and giving people back their land is important, or may be important, and may be used as a tool from the point of view of design or blocking design, if you will, or yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Radu.
Thank you.